This is Learning from History, Part 13.
This presentation, in two parts, covers the story of the missing years of Jesus and his twin brother Thomas, followed in the second part by Druid philosophy and practice, the world in which they found themselves and were educated.
Take each part at a time and draw your own conclusions. I'll try and present you with as much information as I possibly can, which is the result of about 20 years research on the various subjects. Now, the primary sources and references for this material is from The Genius of the Few and The Path of Light by Christian and Barbara Joy O'Brien, together with The Shining Ones, which is their master copy, if you like, of all the key subjects. In addition, St. Paul in Britain by the Reverend R.W. Morgan, one of our great historians in the 1850s, 60s, and Lawrence Gardner's work on the Grail Enigma, and a book called God's Credentials by Philip Blair, which also has a major contribution which I'm going to come to. In addition, there is a yet to be published 28-page paper together with detailed references on church origins in Britain, and that's been prepared by best-selling author, an acknowledged specialist in Christian history, Lawrence Gardner. And Lawrence sadly died 5 years ago, but this work can be inspected on the Golden Age Project website. Also, another very important book, which is by Percy E. Corbett, called Why Britain? That will be possible as a free download on the Golden Age Project website. And another book I found useful is a book called Roderick Dunkley, and it's called Beyond the Gospels, an investigation into the information on the life of Christ to be found outside the Gospels. So the first section is Jesus and his twin brother Thomas. The name of Jesus is not so much written as ploughed into the history of the world. Ralph Waldo Emerson, 1803 to 1882. He was seen as a champion of individualism and prescient critic of the countervailing pressures of society. The second reference here is by Sir James George Fraser, who lived between 1854 and 1941. And he says this: "The doubts which have been cast on the historical reality of Jesus are, in my judgment, unworthy of serious attention." And he was the author of The Golden Bough and The Life of Jesus, which in fact upset the Catholic Church. He went into great detail on Jesus' life and connected it to the key parts of what were going on with Herod the Great and then Herod Antipas. And I'm going to show you here that there was a very important British link for Jesus and Thomas, and a very important role which they had with Augustus Caesar in Rome. So their story, Jesus and Thomas, was much more widely based than we've been led to believe, and we find Jesus and Thomas working together and dealing with the basic religion, and I'm going to suggest that what they were doing was restating Druidism in its purest and simple form. And that's very clear by the similarity of their writings, the Acts of Thomas, and very, very important here is the evidence, great deal of evidence that supports the fact that Thomas and Jesus were in regular contact right up to the time when Jesus died, and of course their trips and time spent in India, southern India, northern India, and also Kashmir. Now, the real clues here that there's something much more than we've been taught by our Christian friends. And this is shown here in Christian O'Brien's work, his translation of the Askew and Bruce codices, which are primary source documents on the spoken words of Jesus to both men and women in his close circle after the crucifixion, recorded and witnessed by the disciple scribes Matthew, Philip and Thomas, as required for a legal document under Hebraic law. I've said here Christian O'Brien's scholarly secular approach, The Path of Light, as a treatise, reveals the Path of Light as a treatise on spiritual truths taught in the Druidic, mystery and brotherhood schools of the ancient world. It is from these records and similar straightforward teachings of Jesus and Thomas that we can link them to an advanced Druid education in Britain, where traditionally young people completed their education. This source document makes it clear that Jesus physically survived the crucifixion. Now, the Path of Light contains Christian O'Brien's revised translation and arrangement of the Bruce and Askew codices. The Bruce Codex was found at Metanu Erbu in Egypt, and the Askew Codex was found by Dr. Askew, or ended up in his collection in London. They're also known as the Lost Books of the Saviour, or part of the Lost Books of the Saviour. And Muslims call the Lost Books of the Saviour the Injil, with the alternative spelling of Injil rather than Gil, which is the Arabic name for what the Muslims believe to be the original lost Gospel of Jesus, who they called Isa. The Injil is one of the 4 Islamic holy books which the Quran records as revealed by God, the others being the Zabur, possibly the Psalms, the Torah and the Quran. The Path of Light and the Acts of Thomas provide solid evidence of the important roles of both Jesus and Thomas in restating and teaching the Druid, which is the same as the Essene philosophy and practice, continued by the Syrian church in Edessa, Upper Mesopotamia, and adopted later by Islam, Sufi, Sunni and Shia. Additional research here on this subject by Paul Bedson. In the key quote, which is very important that we look at, because we're looking at a belief in the transmigration of the soul, second lives, which was believed by people in the ancient world. It was a very important part of the ancient world that we actually had somewhere to go after we left our bodies on this earth. And this is a key quote. And it says here, it is necessary that they should find the initiation which is in the books of Jude, and which I caused Enoch to write in the Garden of Eden when I spoke to him in the building of knowledge and the building of life. Jesus of Nazareth, Teachings of the Master, Bruce Codex, page 222. Christian O'Brien's translation of the Askew and Bruce Codices, 2nd century AD Egyptian Coptic copies of original documents, recorded the spoken words of Jesus of Nazareth, presented within the text of the Path of Light, provide authoritative and detailed support of the existence and journeys of the soul. It also provides the scriptural evidence that Jesus taught Surat, which is soul, Shabad, word, yoga, union. Soul, word, union. And he should be recognized as a perfect living master. The overall background of the migrations and our history is very well explained by Dionysius of Susiana in AD 3, when Jesus was 10 years old. And it goes like this. Upon the Tessurian Sea the people live who style themselves Phoenicians. These were the great first founders of the world, founders of cities and of mighty states, who showed a path through seas before unknown. In the first ages, when the sons of men knew not which way to turn them, they assigned to each his first department they bestowed, of land a portion, of sea a lot, and sent each wandering tribe far off to share a different soil and climate. Hence arose a great diversity, so plainly seen, mid nations widely severed. Dionysius of Susiana, AD 3. This is very important because this ties in with the Golden Age and the ancient city-states. And with the ancient city-states we had a perfect system of social organisation which delivered equal rights under the law to every citizen, which is the true meaning of democracy. Very, very important. There was no religion to interfere as such. It was certainly the Druid practice was more philosophical, with basic conditions for people to observe good lives. I'm going to come to some more detail on that later. The next quote I'm going to put in at this particular point, in case you all think I'm pushing the limits too far, and it's by Archdeacon William Paley, a Doctor of Divinity, who lived between 1743 and 1805. There is a principle which is the bar against all information, which is proof against all argument, and which cannot fail to keep a man in everlasting ignorance. This is the principle of contempt prior to examination. I've always rather liked that. Now we get on to the migrations of our ancestors, who all modern genetics tells us that all our ancestors stem from the Eastern Mediterranean, the Levant, and that's where the start of farming was. And we have people moving all over the world from the very early times. And I'm going to just introduce you to a man called Tros, who was an ancestor of Aeneas and Brutus, and Hector, the king of the Franks. And also Aeneas, of course, was the ancestors of Julius Caesar, and Brutus and Priadane and Ad the Great were all ancestors of the Britons. And the important thing is the closeness of Brutus and Aeneas were very closely related. And so when we have the founding of Rome and the story of Romulus and Remus, then Aeneas comes into that picture as an ancestor of Romulus and Remus. And Brutus, of course, arrived with his army here in Totnes, where I'm giving you this talk. And there's wonderful stories about finding the area between here and Cornwall very much deserted. And there was a reason for that, which was very difficult times, cometary debris, and I'm coming to that later. And all he found were several very large giants. That's the folk's history. The close historical links between Brutus in Britain and Aeneas, the founder of Rome, provided the special relationship and peaceful trading before and during the reigns of Augustus and Tiberius, which is described as the 100 years of peace called Pax Romana, when great progress was made between Britain and Rome. And that was between something like after Caesar came to Britain, principally to put down a local revolt and to reach trade deals with the people living in East Anglia. We have a later invasion of Britain in 43 AD by Claudius for slightly different reasons, and things began to break down as the Roman emperors got madder and madder, had more extreme ideas, and greater problems followed, mainly because of this tremendous success of the trade with Britain and other parts of the world, which made Rome very rich, and people in Rome very jealous, particularly the families of the Caesar, who ended up by fighting and killing one another. Now I want to start very clearly with the family tree of Jeshua, or Jesus. His Jewish name was Jeshua. We called him Jesus, and all marriages were normally arranged when the offspring were infants. In the case of Jesus, an unscheduled liaison between a man called Panta Nero and Miriam of Bethany, probably in Rome when Miriam of Bethany was 18, at the court of Augustus, produced twins, Jeshua Jesus and Judah the Thomas Didymus, and Didymus means twin, in BC 7. So Jesus actually was called and referred to as Jeshua ben Pantera, Jeshua son of Panteria, in the Talmud, very clearly and many times. He was recorded alive in Rome in 45 and 49 AD as Chrestus, and the Council of Nicaea regarded Chrestus as the progenitor of Christianity in Rome, and he was credited with starting and promoting Christianity. And he died in 79 AD in Srinagar, Kashmir, which the Indian government had provided a lot of additional references and support and confirmation. Thomas died in Mylapore in India in AD 82. His remains were later returned to Edessa in Syria, a centre of the Eastern Christian Church. He founded the first Christian church in Kerala, India, in 54 AD. So we have these two boys clearly having an extraordinary future and spreading the word, and it was a restatement of Druidism. Now, Jesus' father was Pantera Nero, a Claudian, born in 42 BC, died in 37 AD, and he was Rome's most successful military leader. Very important. He was a man with great compassion who did a lot of very good resettling of people rather than killing them, and he set a wonderful example to the Roman army, and he was considered Rome's most successful military leader. And he was the son of the second wife of Augustus, and was adopted by Augustus to succeed him as Roman Emperor Tiberius Caesar. So Jesus' father became Tiberius Caesar, Thomas's father, the same man. Now he returned to the court of Augustus in Rome in 8 BC, which ties in with his liaison with Miriam of Bethany, Jesus' mother. He succeeded Emperor Augustus in 14 AD, and sadly he was murdered, very clearly murdered, and it may well have involved his successor Caligula in 37 AD at Mycenaeum in Italy. Miriam, Jesus' mother, born 26 BC and died 50 AD at Marie on the Afghan border. She was a dynastic heiress, tracing her lineage back to both Moses and the sister of Moses, who was called Miriam. To cover the embarrassment of children out of wedlock, Miriam married Joseph of Arimathea, a key figure at both the court of Augustus and the court of Herod, and to whom she may well have been originally intended. You can see the complications here of when you adopt people and when you give them different names, and how that makes it so difficult to track the truth. And I've been fortunate enough to have a genealogy which came from the Vatican archives, which was the most accurate that we've found on these particular subjects and stories, and they dovetail in perfectly with dates and all the other information, or much of the other information we know about Mary, Jesus, Joseph and Thomas. So I'm now going to look at Joseph of Arimathea's family, and we're talking here about, firstly, the Joseph who married Mary, Jesus' mother, but also his father. And his father was Jacob the Patriarch. He was on the line from King David, so he's basically, if you like, from Judea. But the hereditary title he was given by the Roman emperors was rama theo. It's not Arimathea, it's rama theo, which means exalted of the gods. And it was one of the most senior titles that could be given to somebody working for the Roman emperors. And so the father of the Joseph who married Mary, Jacob the Patriarch, was one of the most important people in Rome. And this is why he was a key figure in the court of Herod and a key figure in the court of Augustus in Rome. Now, he was born in 28 BC. He became the Zebedee in 29 AD and died in Jerusalem in AD 40. So we hear of Joseph of Arimathea being killed in Jerusalem, but it was the father or stepfather of Jesus. And so the title passed on to Mary's eldest son, Joseph. And this is the interesting point, that it separates Jesus and Thomas as being half-brothers to Joseph of Arimathea the third. Jacob the Patriarch, number one, Joseph of Arimathea. Number two was his son, and number three was Jesus' half-brother. And so their eldest son, Jacob the Just, was also called James or Joseph, and was the third Joseph of Arimathea, who was born in BC 4 at Qumran. So it's half-brother of Jesus and Thomas. And he inherited his father's title of Arimathea. So the Arimathea comes through 3 generations. Now, you know him as Joseph of Arimathea. Well, I call him Joseph of Arimathea the third. And he died at AD 82 at Glastonbury, Avalon, and was buried there. Or possibly he may have been buried at Cardiff. This is another piece of very interesting evidence, and I'm going to come to that later. He founded the first Christian church in Britain at Llanillid in 62 AD with Urgane, the daughter of Caractacus. It's when they came back from Rome. But I've recently discovered that he almost certainly was involved in setting up the earlier church at Llandaff, just outside Cardiff, a year before, at 61 AD. So we've got an incredible story here of Joseph of Arimathea being involved in Britain, and he was over here in Britain regularly because of the trade, the minerals, the coal, the iron, and in particular everything that was going on in South Wales. Now, Joseph of Arimathea III married first Mary Cleopas, his half-aunt, in 36 AD, producing Anna, who married British Bran Baruch, and he had a second wife, Aurora, who was daughter of the Pictish king Sindine in 57 AD. So you can see an extraordinary mix of marriages and relationships between Judea, the court of Herod, the court of Augustus, and the British court. And Mary, the mother of Jesus, had an aunt who was married to a much earlier British king at about 100 BC, and I'm going to show that in a minute. Here at the top of this genealogical record we have Beli the Great, 100 BC, and Mary's great aunt married Beli the Great. And this is put together by R.W. Morgan, but it needs modifying with what we now know, because we have a story here of Cunobelinius, who was head of the Catula based at Wheathampstead, and his role was taken over by Tenvantius. It's spelt several ways. They didn't have our rigid Oxford way of spelling things and writing things, so I can use variations which sound like the original name. And on this family tree we have a man called Cymbeline. We also have Arivagus, Guderius, Caradoc, Pomponia Greciana, and Caradoc's children here, 5 children on this particular genealogy. And I'm going to come to this family a bit later on and give you more detail, but we run right the way through to Constantine the Great, through King Cole of Colchester, Helen, and links to Lucius, who built the first church in London below St Paul's at Ludgate, and there's a sign on the wall in that St Peter's Ludgate proclaiming his first Christian king to build a church in London. And then of course there was a royal decree eventually at Winchester. Winchester had been the capital of Britain going back to Malutius in 500 BC. Now the key message here to confirm my belief that Jesus and Thomas were restating Druidism is from their education. Now we know they would have been educated in the home of their stepfather Joseph and by my mother Mary. From the dates of the following children, 5 or 6 children, we find that most of those children were born at Qumran in about 4 BC, 6 BC, 8 BC. So Qumran was very much a place where the family went to live. Also Alexandria, when they were very young, the court of Herod, the court of Augustus, the British court, and the Druid academies. So they had a very comprehensive education. Now the key place that they would have gone to after Qumran would have been Alexandria on the Nile Delta. And we know that from the records that their tutor was Philo, who was a very distinguished teacher in Alexandria. And of course Alexandria at that point of time was one of the great centres of learning. Everything had been gathered there in the Serapeum library by the Ptolemies, who were the generals under Alexander the Great, and they'd reached amazing heights of sophistication in science, mechanics, history, you name it. And it was the great philosophers of Alexandria who knew that there was a golden age, that was a period of time when man had made great progress, and this goes back to the great city-states, and the destruction of the city-states came about in 2345, the final destruction, but I'll come to that later. But on this lovely slide we have a picture of the Pharos lighthouse, which worked wonderfully for hundreds of years. We have the old harbour and the new harbour, and a nice view across the harbour. Qumran by the Dead Sea and the caves on the right, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, and Qumran is there, the second town from the top below Jericho, on the banks of the Dead Sea, and about 7 miles from Jerusalem. Very important centre for the Essene. There was an Essene quarter in Jerusalem, and the Essenes were, if you like, the intellectuals who had their own much older version of events, if you like, in terms of history, than the Judeans, who had their books written for them by Ezra while they were in exile in Babylon about 500 BC. And that always gave a conflict between the Judeans and their books, the Torah, and the old religion or the old system of doing things, which was Druidism. Well, Pythagoras was a Druid, as I say, Philo was a Druid, and so these boys were getting a Druid education, much deeper, much wider, much more spiritual than the education they would have got as Jews. next important stop for them, the house of Herod, obviously, with Mary and Joseph of Arimathea being at the court of Herod, usually on business, but there were very close family relationships. Herod had a palace in Rome. Herod was the vassal king, if you like, of Augustus, Herod the Great, and then his son took over, Herod Agrippa. And it was that particular phase that was written about by James Fraser. Here you have pictures of Tiberius, in the middle the Senate, Augustus, who was named Octavian, and Augustus was the title, so there's confusion between who Octavian was and who Augustus was, but Octavian was given the title of Augustus for sorting out the problems with a tripartite system of individual emperors who managed to fight one another, and he came out victorious and dealt with the issues and brought stability and peace. And the greatest general of the times was in fact Tiberius. And that's a map of the Roman Empire, a very significant map of the Roman Empire, which goes literally on here to Scotland, right the way down into Egypt and Syria and to onto Persia. And that actual picture is of the inside of Augustus's palace. Now this is interesting because this comes into several books who've raised this issue of Jesus being called Jeshua ben Pantera, son of a man called Pantera, in the Talmud. And this is a memorial to Tiberius Julius Abdus Pantera, a soldier who had claimed to be the Pantaria named by Talmud. And it is a memorial to a great general and all his achievements. And the area where this statue had been, a memorial had been placed, was a place where he had been particularly helpful to the various tribes that he reallocated land to in that area. In Britain we had an interesting story because we find that Britain in 9 AD, which was when Jesus and Thomas went to Augustus's court in Colchester, in fact, which was the capital of the Tenvantius, which is down there on the right in Essex, and then first gone to Wheathampstead, which is the Caccialavone, and Jesus had been given control of the army, of the Caccialavone army, in AD 9, when he took the army and had peaceful reconciliation with the Tenvantius and combined the two tribes peacefully, and that was first step in his bringing together the whole of Britain. On the same map you'll see very clearly, the left-hand map, you'll see Caccialavone and Tenvantius, and Thomas, whose name was Epikatos, he took over the Atrebate kingdom and extended it to the Regnai kingdom, and that took in Winchester and Wallingford at the north, Winchester at the south. And one of the most interesting clues we have of the mentions of Thomas and Alfred the Great, and the mentions of Alfred in the Anglo-Saxon chronicles. So they were all coin-using tribes, gold coins, in late Iron Age Britain. Now Tenvantius Tascovanus, king of the Caccialavoni, was a long-standing friend of Rome, who exploited the very important peaceful trading and advantages with Augustus. Tenvantius has sent his two sons to be educated at the court of Augustus. However, they had been killed fighting for the Romans under the man who would become Emperor Tiberius Caesar. Tiberius Caesar being Jesus' father. Augustus and Tiberius decided that Jesus and Thomas should be adopted by Tenvantius to secure the Roman-friendly succession in the most productive and authoritative part of Britain. And the boys arrived in Britain, probably Wheathampstead, near St Albans, for their Druid education around 5 AD at the court of Tenvantius, when they were 12, adopted by Tenvantius, who had lost his sons fighting for the Romans. In Rome, Jesus was said to have been the favourite of Augustus, and clearly both boys had excelled in their studies and accumulation of knowledge. Jesus' first test came at the age of 16 when he led the Cunobelinius army against the neighbouring troublesome Tenvantius, based at Colchester. Augustus had insisted that the boys took Roman weapons with them to Britain, which may have acted as a deterrent. However, Jesus was not only to bring about a peaceful settlement, but was able to merge the two tribes into a much stronger unit. Jesus and Thomas, through their mother and father, were on the line of David and the Caesars, linking back to Aeneas and Brutus. This was an added reason for the Druid council to appoint Jesus as the first Pendragon, which means King of Kings, of the Britannic Isle, when his adopted father, King Tenvantius, already an old man, died in 10 AD, and Jesus became king at the age of 17. Here we have a picture of Colchester as it's been visualised, linked to the River Colne, to the sea. 100-ton ships have regularly been coming up the Colne ever since Roman times. I've watched them, I've been down to the docks. It's part of where my family moved to when they left as Huguenots in the 1600s. And this is as it was. Right in the heart, if you like, of the very productive arable land, and grain and hides and many other things were exported to Rome, and many imports, of course, came in from Rome. Colchester became the capital of the merged Cunobelinius and Tenvantius tribes. The Roman name for Colchester then was Camulot, which is a straight Romanization of the original Celtic place name Camulodon, which means fortress of Camulos. Camulus was the Celtic war god, the meaning of whose name is powerful, and was also associated by the Romans with their own god of war, Mars. You have this extraordinary link here too, and many people have raised this possibility that you only have to change the D to a T, and you have Camulot. And clearly Camulot was based, in my opinion, at Colchester when Jesus was king. As King of Kings, he would have brought all the various regional kings to Colchester for round table conferences, as used to happen way back in Sumeria in the ancient days. The Druids and the kings all met in council in the original homelands. You even find those people who populated the Pacific came back to Nan Madal for annual meetings of Druids and kings to sort out the problems of administering their particular city-states, islands, whatever. And Jesus would have been doing the same thing here with the kind of tradition that came through from the Near East. This on the left is a gold starter of Cunobelin. It means Hound of Bel. That was Jesus' new title under the Druids. And it was minted in the year that he took the kingship. This superb example of the late Celtic moneyer's art is inscribed on the obverse with the name CVNO, which means Berlin, beneath an image of a prancing horse, perhaps a symbol of freedom, and on the reverse the word CAMV, which is short for the town. Inscribed on either side of an ear of wheat, a symbol of prosperity. Our wheat exports were something that we were doing very well and earning money from, with a willing buyer and a willing seller with the Romans. A bit later, Rome took a much stronger hold following the dreadful rape of Boadicea's daughters, and then a great rebellion which flattened Colchester, and then the Roman legions killing thousands of Boadicea's followers, and she committed suicide. And that ended really the positive phase in British arrangements with the Romans, and it was, of course, we had Caligula and then Nero coming in, and Nero just took it upon himself to send out the soldiers and kill as many people as possible. The Silures were the most important tribe in the west of England, and of course Caractacus and Arivagus carried on resisting the Roman incursions into that Welsh area, and although Caractacus was captured and taken to Rome, and of course Caractacus is Jesus' son, then we find that Arivagus still maintains the resistance, and the Romans were never able to make incursions into Wales thanks to the British resistance. But they did form those much larger areas of their administration. And of course there were much smaller kingships in Scotland which signed treaties and did deals, although of course the Hadrian's Wall and the Antonine Wall involved as well. So the initial peace Romana under Augustus and Tiberius collapsed as soon as the Essene rebelled against the appalling behaviour of Nero's generals and troops. That is Colchester Castle, built on the foundations of the Temple of Claudius, which came about round about 46 AD after the second invasion under Claudius. And the very interesting stories here, whereby they had a peace treaty, Claudius adopted Caractacus' daughter. Jesus who had become an arch-Druid by that time, was built a palace by Claudius. He's certainly around at 44 AD, 45 AD in England, very much alive, although he'd been sent by Tiberius Caesar to try, and also Thomas, to help resolve the problems for the Romans in Judea. So we have Jesus and Thomas actually going to Judea late in their lives, or relatively late in their lives, to try and resolve peace in Judea. They were the peacemakers who went to Judea. That was Jesus' primary role in Judea. Now Cunobelinius is the name, which means Hound of Bel. He's also Cymbeline, and in Welsh is the legendary Cyneflyn, the legendary king of the Welsh. The legendary adopted son of a legendary stepfather proceeded to gain the respect of all parts of the British Isles, greatly increasing trade, prosperity and peace for all citizens. In AD 27 he retired to be one of 3 arch-druids, and he was called Bran, which is another title, handing over the responsibility for running Britain to his sons, Adminius, Guiderius and Caractacus, as regional kings, and other leaders loyal to him, including his the nephews, in fact, of Tenvantius, called Arivagus. Thomas was called Epicatus and initially made king of the Atrebates, and I've explained where that was, somewhere near Wallingford. He carried out many roles in Britain as an architect and administrator, from Wallingford and Winchester to Shetland, where he is the patron saint. Around 28, Emperor Tiberius suggested that Jesus and Thomas return to Judea to try and bring peace to that deeply troubled area. So you have from this time Jesus going to Judea, and certainly coming back and being in Judea, back in England in AD 43, and also going to Rome with Caractacus when Caractacus and his family went into exile following his capture by the Romans. He was betrayed by an English queen in the Midlands, and he went into exile in Rome. And I've dealt with his famous speech in Jesus and Thomas, part 12. Now the Acts of Thomas are the records of Thomas's teachings and Thomas's history. this is very important because we find that in the Acts of Thomas, which is there, and in that monastery, St. Catherine's Monastery, Sinai, it houses the oldest version of the Acts of Thomas. And it's perfectly clear that Thomas was having regular meetings with Jesus in India. It's written in a key part of the Acts of Thomas. And it was translated by a Church of England priest who translated it as Thomas was having regular visions of Jesus. And he said that because he couldn't possibly tell the world that Jesus didn't die on the cross. So we have that solid evidence, much more added evidence, the fact that Jesus did not die on the cross, and there are many references to Jesus being around and doing things. So the idea that he died on the cross is totally wrong, and of course it has a major impact on our Christians and their belief in what they've been told. Now, I learnt this from Hugh MacGregor Ross, who lived at Painswick, who was the leading specialist on St. Thomas. And his books were available at one point on the website, and I'll try and make them available again. Marvellous books on Thomas and the writings of Thomas. And he was the man who told me about this translation and wanted me to go out there and see the original manuscript and verify it. So if any of you are going to St. Catherine's Monastery, take a good translator with you and see if you can do that job for me, because I've got enough on my job list as it is, but it's there to be looked at. Now, the background on the importance of Thomas. I've made the point that Thomas was having regular meetings with Jesus in India. The first Christian Syrian or Syriac church in India was founded by Thomas in Kerala, southwest India, in AD 54, 2 years after he arrived, before the Caractacus family returned from exile in Rome to found churches with Ilid, half-brother, which is Joseph James, or the youngest Joseph of Arimathea, and Ilid was the Welsh name of Joseph of Arimathea III. And they founded churches, in fact, at Llandaff in AD 62, Llanillid in 63, and Glastonbury AD 65. That was when the family returned from exile in Rome. Now, this is a key interest point and ties us into the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles. Britain's King Alfred sent an embassy to Kerala, India, in AD 883, headed by Sighelm, Bishop of Sherborne, to visit the tomb of Thomas in what has now become the most Christian state in India. This is recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles. The Syrian church remains wonderfully integrated in its social customs with the surrounding Hinduism. This is a map of southern India, and these traditions go back to the 1st century. 7 churches were established by Thomas the Apostle during his mission in Malabar, and those are the names of them below. I'm not going to try and pronounce them, you can look at the text yourself. This is a quote from B. Griffiths of Christ in India, his book, Christ in India. That many people have written books and produced evidence of Christ in India. I'll read this extract. The church in Kerala is said to have been founded by St. Thomas the Apostle in the year AD 52. In fact, it was AD 54, 2 years after he arrived in AD 52. One of the first instinct is to dismiss this as a legend, like most of the legends of the apostles. But there is apparently more ground for it than one might expect. The legend derives from the apocryphal Acts of Thomas, which date from the 3rd century, the same reference I referred to earlier. These are certainly not historical, but they indicate that there was a tradition connecting Thomas with India in the 3rd century, and they have been found to be correct in certain historical details, so that they cannot be dismissed altogether. They are supported at least in regard to the fact that St. Thomas visited India by a very strong tradition among the church fathers, St. Ephrem the Syrian, St. Ambrose, St. Jerome, St. Gregory of Nazianzus, and St. Gregory of Tours all mention the apostolate of Thomas in India as something to be compared to that of St. Peter in Rome, St. Andrew in Epirus, and St. John in Ephesus. In the book The Jesus Sutras, which is Rediscovering the Lost Religion of Taoist Christianity by Martin Palmer, the rediscovery by Martin Palmer of one of the earliest Taoist Christian monasteries, including an 8th century pagoda in China, Darquen Pagoda and Terrace, evidence of the earliest Thomasin missions reaching China. Quite recently we even had a Japanese story of Jesus being buried in Japan. It seems pretty obvious both Jesus and Thomas would have gone as far east as they could. So all these stories are cropping up and worthy of a great deal of further investigation. Now, as far as the founding of the British National Church goes, it's very important we look at the evidence there, and I provided a great deal of evidence in Learning from History Part 12 of all the conferences held, 4 major conferences held by the Roman Catholic Church, all agreeing that Christianity started in Britain around about AD 34, and I mentioned the 2 great historians for the Catholic Church, Polydore Virgulo, who wrote a history of Britain for Henry VII, and Cesare Baronius, who almost became Pope, who was the Vatican librarian round about 1600. And they all confirmed that Christianity started in Britain round about AD 36. Very important. And the Anglican bishop, James Asher, was a very famous British church historian. And he wrote, in the 17th century, the British National Church was founded in AD 36, 160 years before the heathen Rome confessed to Christianity. The mother church of the British Isles is the church in insular Avalonia called by the Saxons Glaston. And of course the mother church should also refer to the key churches in Wales. From the information now recovered, we can claim that Jesus founded Christianity as a restatement of Druidism when he became the Pendragon King of Britons in AD 10. So we can, with the information we can now have, we can link Druidism, Jesus as Pendragon, and a genuine restatement of Druidism, starting with Jesus in AD 10. Remember, he was an arch-druid when he retired. So now we start the second subject, which ties in so closely with what I've been talking about and the lives of Jesus and Thomas. And this section is on Druid philosophy and practice. Druid philosophy and practice centered on the truth before the world and a doctrine that without freedom of will there is no humanity. Freedom of conscience was both the birth and breath of manhood. The essence of the soul was will. That's a wonderful quote and a wonderful statement which sums up very advanced people, highly educated people. Good government and peace through kingship was a fundamental requirement, and religion as we know it did not exist. This contrasts from AD 400 with Augustine of Hippos, that's in North Africa, Hippo, Roman Catholic doctrine of original sin, the denigration of women, burning libraries and killing Arian Christians, all crimes against humanity, with seeds being sown for everlasting conflicts to this day. The British Christian Church, based on free will, education and craftsmanship, was finally overturned at the Synod of Whitby in AD 664 by Rome-supported Northumberland king and replaced by Roman Catholicism. Now this is the history of Rome, because when we compare the history of Rome and Druidism, we see two very interesting diverge problems. The history of Rome. The earliest Romans came from Troy, led by Trojan prince Aeneas, a close relative of Brutus and the local Etruscan king in Italy, arrived by sea at the mouth of the Tiber, finding that this was an ideal place to settle. They founded their first settlement further up the river around 752 BC, possibly earlier. Romulus and Remus, the famous twins, who in myth were given credit for founding the city-state, were descendants of Aeneas. The Roman Republic was founded around 509 BC after the last of 7 kings of Rome, Tarquin the Proud, was disposed by Lucius Junius Brutus. Now this city-state situation, city-state kingship ended. It was a crucial point in Roman history. This broke with the ancient tradition of city-state kingship, where the best man was chosen to represent the best interests of his subjects, advised by qualified Druids, in order to deliver freedom, justice, leisure and instruction for all the people. The city-state is important because what was achieved by the city-states and their method of social organisation was that they delivered not only freedom, justice, leisure and instruction for all the people, but they also enabled equal rights under the law for every citizen, whether they were a slave, whether they were whatever class they were. Neither king nor God, anybody was above the law. And that was the true meaning of democracy, when you have a system which has laws, rules and is fair and delivers equal rights under the law. Now, despite the high ideals in setting up a new system of social organisation and politics, leaders began to serve themselves rather than the people. Rome progressed from a monarchy to an autocratic republic, and then towards an increasingly autocratic empire run by an emperor, starting with Caesar, ending in a perpetual dictatorship. There were seeds of destruction. The amassing of disproportionate wealth by a few men was a major factor in this transition, and in reality this amounted to organised crime on a grand scale, with no respect for the law or the people. No surprise then that the system was plagued by instability, infighting and civil wars, with only little more than 100 peaceful years under the influence of peacemakers Augustus and Tiberius, and this was called Pax Romana, before the great extent of the Roman conquest and occupation culminated under Trajan in 117 AD. This was the golden period for Rome and for civilization. There were other good emperors in Hadrian and Marcus Aurelius. When he was followed by Commodus in 180 AD, Rome went into terminal decline, crippled by debt, bankruptcy and chaos. So the decline and decay. Rome had grown out of greatness of individual character. It became a community in which individual character counted for nothing compared with an abstraction which proved, in the hour of testing, capable of nothing. By sacrificing the individual to the state, the rulers of the Roman world determined the real virtues which sustained it. They turned active and self-respecting citizens into inert and selfish ones. They discouraged the capitalist from thrift and foresight, the trader from enterprise, the craftsman from his hereditary skill, the husband from pride in the soil, the mother from maternity, and the soldier from courage and self-sacrifice. They made the moral shell that protected society so soft that it could protect it no longer. Creeping inertia paralysed everyone and everything. Even before the barbarians broke in, the elegant cities had begun to crumble. Trade died for want of purchasers. Now, Druidism's superb social organisation. The Druids also represented an absolute threat to the Roman state because their science and philosophy dangerously contradicted Roman orthodoxy. Romans were materialistic, Druids spiritual. For the Romans, the state was a monolithic structure spread over territories deliberately organised into a hierarchy. With the Druids, it was a freely consented moral order with an entirely stable system of social organisation, with the common ownership of land and the fair allocation of that land for the full benefit of the whole community. The Romans looked at women as bearers of children and objects of pleasure. Druid women were equal partners in that social organisation. And this is the quote by Professor Germanica in his book La Femme Celte, 1972. The talent of the Romans in ridding themselves of the Gaelic and British elites is always considered astonishing, but this leaves out of account the fact that it was a matter of life and death to Roman society. So what have we learned in 2065 years? There was a further reason for Rome's decay. At its root lay a lack of faith and hope. The citizens and rulers of Europe came in the end to see no purpose either in society or their own lives. And it's all very well summed up and should warn us of what's happening today by Cicero in 55 BC. The budget should be balanced, the treasury should be refilled, public debt should be reduced, the arrogance of officialdom should be tempered and controlled, and the assistance of foreign land should be curtailed, lest Rome become bankrupt. People must again learn to work instead of living on public assistance. Wonderful parallel to the problems of today in Britain and most parts of the world. Now I'm going to give you a little bit of Druid history. The date of 3903 BC, calculated from the Druid records to be the precise astronomical date of the arrival of missionaries from Sidon, that's in the Eastern Mediterranean, into Britain, and the founding in Britain of the Druidic system of social administration based on the divine laws of the Shining Ones and the philosophy of the archaic world. This required well-educated monarchs as tenants of the gods to lead each of the city-states. The king's primary role was to deliver to the people freedom, justice, leisure and instruction. Neither God nor king or the people were above the law, and the law was the edicts of Anu and Enu, or the divine justice of the immortal gods. I'm going to come to the detail of that later. Excommunication was a punishment or deterrent for serious wrongdoing. In the European languages, Druid, along with Dharma, translates as strong knowledge. We find distinctly long-headed people constructing the earliest long barrows and observatories around this time in the British Isles, with the wide introduction of mixed farming methods. Now I have a wonderful image of a gold and obsidian vase dated about 1850 BC, which is a present from Pharaoh Amenhotep II, and it's in the National Museum of Beirut. And what's special about this is that the gold was heated to over 5,000 degrees to produce pure gold, a very important technical achievement at that date, in addition to the working and polishing of obsidian, which is the hardest volcanic rock. And beneath that we have, before 1400 BC, an extraordinary explanation here of the knowledge of black holes. And I wrote this letter, and it was published in the Daily Mail on Tuesday the 27th of July 2004, and I say the follows. I've reproduced below an extract from what are commonly known as the Urogrit or Rashamara cuneiform tablets, which date before 1400 BC. It is from one of a series of 10 letters from one having responsibility in the Sarman Brotherhood to the Prince of the Land of the Four Directions at the Royal School of Ugarit, being an aspirant to the Brotherhood. This item relates to instructions on astronomy from tutor to pupil at a superb pre-Christian university on the Syrian coast north of Tyre and Sidon. It goes as follows. And we are told that the stars without number that we've seen in the heavens, each one the progeny, the inhabitants of heaven, will in their turn populate the heavens to time without end. So the story goes that when a sun or star dies, it goes forth in a piercing flash of light after compressing upon itself until it can compress no more, and flies apart in a myriad of particles, each part finding itself a space where it can gather from the heavenly soil nourishment for its growth, and in due course make itself a world, as our Lord Shamash has done. And that's from the Phoenician Letters by Wilfrid Davis and G. Zur. That's 1979, Merritt Publishing, a central reading on the enormous sophistication of our ancestors as not only science and astronomy, but social organisation. Druid Britain. There were in Britain, south of the Clyde and Forth, 40 Druidic universities, which were also capitals of the 40 tribes, the originals of our modern counties, which preserved for the most part the ancient tribal limits. Hence, for instance, Yorkshire retains the same disproportionate magnitude to our other countries as the territories of the Brigantes, its British tribe, did to those of other tribes. Of these 40 seats, 9 have disappeared. The remainder were as follows. 3 seats of the Archdruids of Britain, which is Caerlad, which is the city of the Lake of the Tame, which is the Thames, Caia Troia, or that means the beautiful lake, or fair meaning, or beautiful, hence Tane, so called in Britain. Tyne, it still is the North Britain, a name like North Britain for a river. Caer Evroc, York, and Caerleon, so that's London, York, and Caerleon, which is on the River Usk in South Wales. And the seats of the chief Druids in Britain was Canterbury, Winchester, St Albans, Old Sarum, Salisbury, Carlisle, Cambridge, or Granta, Manchester, Palmcaster, Colchester, Worcester, Chester, Porchester, Doncaster, Warwick, Mervoid, Bristol, Leicester, Uttoxeter, Lincoln, Gloucester, Chichester, Cirencester, Dorchester, Carnarvon, Exeter, Silchester and Bath. The Gildas MS, Julius D, number 9, the Cottonian Library, calls these the 3 arch-flamens and 28 flamens of Britain. Geoffrey of Monmouth appears to have found the same titles on the American version of Hilo's history. Very important, the level of universities of education. These students of these universities numbered at times 60,000 souls, among whom were included the young nobility of Britain and Gaul. It required 20 years to master the circle of Druidic knowledge, nor, when we consider the great range of requirements which such system included, can we wonder at the length of such probation. Natural science, astronomy, arithmetic, geometry, jurisprudence, medicine, poetry and oratory were all proposed and taught, the first 2 with severe exactitude. The system of astronomy, incalculated, had never varied, being the same as that taught by Pythagoras, now known as the Copernican or Newtonian. The British words for star, astronomer, astronomy, are seren, serenid, serenidiath. Hence, the usual Greek term for the Druids was the Serenidai, the astronomers. So the Greeks called the Druids the astronomers. Two images of Druids. There's a modern painting, rather a small squat Druid and a very tall, well-dressed Druid. Contemporary image in the Devizes Museum, and a visualisation of a Druid in front of Stonehenge. Grimes Pond, Dartmoor, a late Bronze Age village for graziers and farmers, abandoned in the 1159 BC due to the massive Hekla stratovolcanic eruption in Iceland. Tin ingots were found in the Bigbury Bay wreck, dated from ship's timbers to 3000 BC. I'm trying to emphasise the tremendous sophistication of the Druids in Britain and the remains of that sophistication. We find in this diagram, which is a map from the Growth of Civilization by W.J. Perry, one of the most important history books, we find gold-bearing granite outcrops, both Dartmoor and Bodmin Moor. Bodmin Moor was the site of a magnificent observational astronomy complex, now proven by computer analysis of the alignments, and marked out on the ground by 12 stone circles and over 90 ridgetop stone cairns dated to 2500 BC. Gold, tin and the highest quality quartz attracted traders from the Near East to these earliest times. Here is a photograph I took of one of the Bodmin Moor ridgetop cairns. Again, the date 2500 BC. And then you see in the distance several of them in the distance, all spaced out, and they were used for observational astronomy. And my belief is that this was the centre of the astronomers in the world. The Druids had that knowledge what they'd brought from the land of Canaan, and this is where all our leading astronomers lived and worked. And when they built the Great Pyramids over that period of 100 years on the Giza Plateau, it was the astronomers from Britain who were advising the Sumerians who actually built the Egyptian pyramids the need to build them, because we were going to have a very serious cometary debris problem, which in fact happened in 2345, some 300 years after most of those pyramids were built. So it was a direct link between astronomers in Britain and the building of the Great Pyramids, and I go into that in the other learning from history presentations. There is one of those ridgetop cairns, some of them over 90 feet high, and the remains are there for you to walk and see. And this is the work which is so clearly described by Christian O'Brien in The Shining Ones. And he surveyed it and used his computer to do all the analysis. And Cornwall actually means, first of all, it was Cornwall, now Cerno, and going back, Cerno means rock piles, and then it was known as the land of the cairns. So that was the most famous thing about Cornwall, but not many people know about it. And you can see a lot of places where the stone has been removed to build walls, but you can find the retaining rings which retained those great mounds. Similar sort of sophistication with the great central reeve, massive stones, superior central administration and planning of field systems at a very early dates, seen here on Dartmoor and also at Side Fields and in Pembrokeshire. And Side Fields is on the west coast of Ireland. Attainments of the Druids. On the attainments of the Druids in all the sciences, especially in this of astronomy, classic judges of eminence, Cicero and Caesar, Pliny, Tacitus, Diodorus Siculus and Strabo speak in high terms. In the Druidic order, indeed, centred and from it radiated the whole civil and ecclesiastical knowledge of the realm. They were its statesmen, legislators, priests, physicians, lawyers, teachers, poets. The depositories of human and divine knowledge. Its church and parliament, its courts of law, its colleges of physicians and surgeons, its magistrates, clergy and bishops. The number of Druids was regulated by very stringent laws in proportion to the population. No one could be a candidate for the order who could not, in the May Congress of a tribe, prove his descent from 9 successive generations of free forefathers. Now, this is typical of the ancient world of the city-states and why they ran so smoothly and why they delivered equal rights under the law for every citizen. An interesting separation between ancient Egyptians was that no one presumed to interfere with the occupation of a different trade or work that differed from his or her own. As written by Diodorus, no tradesman was permitted to meddle in political affairs or hold any civil office in the state, lest his thoughts should be distracted by the inconsistency of his pursuits, or by the jealousy and displeasure of the master in whose business he was employed. The ancient Egyptians feared that if no such law existed, in consequence of necessity or desire, the individual or individuals would become conspicuous in public station, and those, by vanity and self-sufficiency, would interfere in matters out of their sphere. A very, very interesting point. So if you're a carpenter, you weren't allowed to mess around and tell a stonemason what to do, and a stonemason wasn't allowed to tell a carpenter what to do. And in our modern world, everybody tells everybody else what to do, and it makes a nonsense of our administration, and it really reveals the importance of Mark Twain's quote, which is 10% of the people think, 10% think they think, and 80% would die rather than think. And that's why one man, one vote doesn't work, and why we desperately need this concept of a system which actually delivers equal rights under the law, which our own British Constitution does, if we observed it. Humane slaughter, sacrifice, we all seem to think the Druids sacrificed and did all sorts of terrible things. Their sacrifice, as was all ancient sacrifice, was in the interest of humanity to the animal. The animal wasn't allowed to come onto any platform unless it was totally relaxed. It was being handled by its owners, and therefore it was relaxed. And what we're seeing here is the movement prior to the animal's jugular vein being cut and the animal going into a dead faint within the process of about 4 seconds without even feeling the knife. I'm now looking at the links between Druids in Britain and the ancient world, and this is a very interesting extract which was provided by Nigel Blair, and it's called The Lost Gods and Shambhala by Nigel Blair. Around 457 BC, when the Buddha was dying, he was visited by a wise man from the west whose name was Sukranda. They swapped some sacred teachings. It was originally thought that Secundra came from the Middle East, but is now thought he came from the West, either Greece or Britain. Secundra means beautiful or white moon, a name that did exist in Welsh, and that many ancient Britons were known by that name. The area around Glastonbury, Somerset, up into South Wales was called Gwentha, which apparently meant the place of bliss. And the Lamas had apparently been told that Secundra had arrived from the place of bliss in the west. What is more, Gwip ap Nud actually means beautiful or white moon. Thus, in addition to ancient British teachers meeting and advising Pythagoras, a similar figure apparently went to visit the Buddha and exchange sacred knowledge with him. And this ties in too with the Greeks adopting the Aleph Beg, or the written language in-house of the Druids. The Greek letters came from Britain from the Druids. Very, very important point I make in another lecture. Bardic verbal tradition is kin to the Kabbalah. The Bardic verbal tradition, Tao, and shamanic systems throughout the world all have the same link.
Scientific American and National Geographic report that North America, and this is then their January to February 2001 issues, was visited from 30,000 years ago by Europeans. And this is worked out by using the haplotype X genetic marker.
The degree of world trade has not been addressed in any major academic institution I know about, although Professor Cyclone Covey at Wake Forest and Steve Omar in Hawaii joined Fell, Kelly and others in addressing what we will cover to some extent again. Now this is a quote here by Robert Baird, author of Diverse Druids. So we have also had more evidence recently of Druids, the Celtic type people, travelling around the world, red-haired people in America, South America, North America, red-haired people in New Zealand, and very much more sophistication and travelling going back much longer periods than people realise. This is Bullfinch's complete mythology and the Druids on page 247. Druids were ministers of tradition and justice among the ancient Celtic nations, men of science and learning. They taught the youth under their charge many things concerning the stars and their motions, the size of the world and the lands, and concerning the might and power of the immortal gods. They were accomplished genealogists. Phoenician letters are key to this knowledge. Nabu was the son of Marduk. Much attention to the order and law of nature, oak wisdom, Wid, strong knowledge again, combined functions of priest, magistrate, scholar and physician. Close analogy to the Brahmins of India and the Magi of Persia, as well as priests of Egypt and Phoenicia. They taught the existence of one god to whom they gave the name Baal, or B-E-A-L, or Baal, there's several spellings of it, which Celtic antiquaries tell us means that life is everything, source of all beings. Clearly the Phoenician Baal and the Sumerian Bel, identification of a supreme deity with the sun. Fire was regarded as a symbol of divinity in Heliopotamus in Cairo. Also paid their respect to numerous inferior gods, ancestor gods, and the children of the sun. They were married, no images of temples as such. Two festivals were Beltane, fire of God, spring equinox, the beginning of May, in honour of the sun. Whitsunday, still in Scotland, and Samhain is called Fire of Peace, 1st of November, Hallow Eve in Scotland, to discharge judicial functions. Selection of quotes from ancient authors on the Druids. In an Irish manuscript it is written that all who are adepts in the druidical and magical arts are the descendants of the Tuatha De Danann, people of the god An or Anu. In Southern Ireland there's still a saying, wise as the Tuatha De Danann. The Isle of Man was named after Danan Manaman, who set up a mystery school on the island and was famous for his powers to transport huge blocks through the air. His ship had no sails or oars, but went wherever he wanted it to go. That the remains of that mystery school is on the southern tip of the Isle of Man. The serpent was subsequently the totem of the House of David. They precede the house of the Persian Magi, Egyptian and Canaanite priests, as well as the Levitical, Brahmin and the Essene traditions. Annual councils of kings and the Druid advisors to kings took place over the millennia in the original homelands. Good government and peace was a fundamental requirement. Religion as we know it did not exist. And this is from O'Brien's book, The Shining Ones, and it's a Tuatha De Danann, the people of the god An, or the descendants of the god An, and Druid tradition. a little poem here by Ockegh van Flynn. They had no vessels. No one really knows whether it was over the heavens or out of the heavens or out of the earth that they came. Were they demons of the devil? Were they men? At some time in the 3rd millennium BC there arrived in Ireland a group of sages who in time were to form the pantheon of the indigenous Old Irish and the early Celtic invaders. In the later Gaelic tongue they were described as Di Antais Dana Acus and Antais, which means, that's made to be translated as, the men of science were gods and the laymen no gods. Their arrival came as a great surprise to the local people because they are said to have appeared suddenly at the top of Slieve an Lerin, the Iron Mountain in County Leitrim. This mountain was considered to be 3 days' march from the coast, and no one had seen the sages crossing the intervening ground or found boats from which they might have landed. It was decided by the elders that they must have burned their boats on the seashore and travelled inland under cover of a magical mist, the mist of Druidic. That's chapter 17, The Shining Ones, Christian and Barbara Joy O'Brien. Julius Caesar on the Druids. Julius Caesar states, as a class, the Druids take no active part in war. In their schools they are said to learn by heart an extraordinary number of lines, and in consequence sometimes to remain under instruction for as many as 20 years, although for most other purposes, in both their public and their private accounts, they have adopted the Greek alphabet. What Caesar didn't know was that the Greeks adopted the Druid alphabet, and this is made very clear by Martin Bernal in his book called Black Athena. And there are lots of lessons for this because the Aleph Beg, as it was called, the alphabet, was used strictly in-house, and it took a long time for it to get from the Druids as the high culture into the culture of the Greeks and earlier the Assyrians. The main object of all education is, in their opinion, to imbue their scholars with a firm belief in the indestructibility of the human soul, which, according to their belief, merely passes at death from one tenement to another. For by such a doctrine alone, they say, which robs death of all its terrors, can the highest form of human courage be developed. Interesting point. You work that one out for yourself. Subsidiary to the teaching of this main principle, they hold various lectures and discussions on astronomy, on the extent of the geographical distribution of the globe, of the different branches of natural philosophy, and the many problems connected with religion. And here is a very clear statement by Robert Baird that they were originators of all religion. There are many secrets and intrigues of old that have simply donned an overcoat of propriety. We will demonstrate the Druids and their red-headed league of megalith builders, or the Tuatha De Danann, are the likely originators of all religion. Now, this is what I'm doing towards the end of this document, and you'll see I'm taking the originators of all religion to the Garden of Eden site at Carsag and the Shining Ones. This source of the teaching of Jesus and the Brotherhood could be re-energized just as Jesus tried to do before others put words in his mouth after he died. The mummies found near the present-day Great Wall of China and those of the Aleutian Islands are just some of the giants we will show were part of this brotherhood of Isis or Jesus. They were on Malta before they built the Pyramid of Giza, and here we find archaeology shows 2,800 years with no weapons. And here is the Reverend R.W. Morgan on the Druids from his brilliant book, St. Paul in Britain. Their motto was the truth against the world. Glastonbury was a leading Druid college and centre before the birth of Christ. Druidism never opposed Christians. Christianity was a new thing in Asia, but there was never a time when the Druids of Britain held not its doctrines. There was a remarkable similarity of the dress of the Archdruid and the Jewish high priest, demonstrating a common origin. Druidism presented a high culture and a priesthood of peace. In parallel, Buddhism was a Druidic religion. By controlling the vast mineral wealth and other resources of Britain for the people of Britain, the Druids presented a serious rival to Greece and Rome. That's Reverend R.W. Morgan, in about 1860, and his book, St. Paul in Britain, obtained so many clues which I've used in my work, and it's very much something that people all should read. And here, a little bit more on Druid history, and this is William Brake. And this is William Brake in Jerusalem, his book Jerusalem. Your ancestors derived their origin from Abraham, Heber, Shem and Noah, who were Druids, as the Druid temples, which are the patriarchal pillars and oak groves over the whole earth, witness to this day. You have a tradition that man anciently contained in his mighty limbs all things in heaven and earth. This you receive from the Druids. So that gives you the very best information I can find on this amazing society, which we must also learn all about. And there are many books which are now giving us very much more detail on the brilliance of the Druids, and far more brilliant, far more successful, far more effective, far more peaceful than anything that's come since their time.